Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I'm Ken Moritsugu. I'm the Bureau Chief for the AP in Tokyo and the moderator for today's event. We're very honored today to have Mr. Norm Pearlstine here to speak to us. I think some of you know him from his previous time in Tokyo a few years ago. And it's been
just a few.
It's been great to see several of you come up to say hello to him and renew your old acquaintances. He's, as I think you all know, he's an extremely distinguished journalist who's worked in the U.S. and in Japan, overseas, in Asia, and in Europe. If I read his resume to you, we wouldn't have time for him to speak, but I'll give you a brief synopsis. He's currently the vice chairman of Time Inc., and I assumed that position in July of this year, I believe. And in that position, one of his responsibilities is to look for international growth opportunities for the company and its brands. He previously worked at the Wall Street Journal, at Time Inc., previously before, and at Bloomberg, holding a number of positions. He was the Tokyo bureau chief for Time in the 1970s, the founding managing editor of the Asian Wall Street Journal, the founding editor of the European Wall Street Journal, and eventually the managing editor and the executive editor of the whole Wall Street Journal. He then went to Time Inc., where he was editor-in-chief for 10 years. After that, to Bloomberg as chief content officer, and then back to Time Inc. as chief content officer before assuming his current position. He's also the recipient of numerous awards. The American Society of Magazine Editors gave him their Lifetime Achievement Award and have inducted him into the Magazine Editors Hall of Fame. He's also received the Loeb Lifetime Achievement Award for Distinguished Business and Financial Journalism. And last but not least, he's the author of a book, Off the Record, The Press, the Government, and the War Over Anonymous Sources. Today he'll talk a bit about a topic we're all very interested in, the American presidential election, and what exactly is happening there, and try to shed some light and clarity on it for those of us watching from over here. And I think he'll also be able to talk a bit about Time Inc.'s transformation as the media world continues to evolve. So without further ado, Mr. Pearlstine.
Thank you very much, Ken. Well, thank you all, and in what I now understand is Tokyo style, I took the liberty of taking my jacket off, so I hope you all feel similarly emboldened. And Ken, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I think it's particularly appropriate that the AP Bureau Chief be here to introduce me, since in my 3 years working in Tokyo, I shared a desk and phone with the AP's copy boy at the time, and that's what passed for a Wall Street Journal presence at that time. In those days, the Journal was really best known for its domestic coverage, and the Tokyo office was a bit of an outpost. In fact, I remember at the time, Herman Nickel was the Time bureau chief, and Herman not only had an office, but had a car and a driver with a Time flag and an American flag and so forth. And I kept writing to the then editor of the Wall Street Journal saying, you know, if you gave me an office like Time magazine had, I could double my productivity. And I wrote 7 different memos to this guy, and he never answered any of them. And I finally met up with him when I was managing editor. His name was Fred Taylor, and I said, Fred, I wrote you 7 memos saying I could double my productivity if you gave me an office like Time had, and you never answered them. What was that all about? And he said, I didn't want double your productivity. So that sort of explained what the Journal thought about Japan and sending me there at the time. It's gotten a whole lot better since then, really, for all of us. But I'm really grateful to be here today, and especially grateful to my colleagues from Time who are with me here, and I'd like to just take a second to introduce them, including, as I'm sure you know, Taro Aikawa, who is head of Time's operations here in Tokyo. In addition, Steve Marcapoto is the president of Time International, and while based in Hong Kong, is a frequent visitor to Japan. He's accompanied by Zohair Abdul Karim, who is Asian regional editor for Time and who's been a colleague of mine for quite a long time, and KF Ong, who is our regional ad sales chief for the region. And so thank you all for making the trip here to join me as well. I thought it appropriate in thinking about a presentation to the FCCJ to talk a bit about this year's election. Presidential elections are always interesting in the U.S., this one more so, and that was even before this weekend. While I was happily flying on JAL from New York to Narita, I didn't realize that Hillary Clinton was not attending many of the events she said she would, because it turned out she had walking pneumonia. The only consolation is that people covering her didn't realize that's why she was doing it either, because in rather typical fashion for this Clinton campaign, it didn't occur to anyone to let people know at the time what her problem was when she was staggering as such. So even though she was diagnosed with pneumonia on a Friday morning, it was not until 2 days later that we learned that's the case, and that she's had to cancel at least a couple days worth of campaign visits. So, but that gives some sense of what I really wanted to talk a bit about, which is the ways in which this campaign has been different from others, and the complications that has created for the press in terms of coverage. Patrick Moynihan, who was a famous senator from New York State, famously said, "You have a right to your own opinions, but not to your own facts." He was wrong. What this campaign has shown is that the candidates very much think they have a right to their own facts, and whether they are being honest or not, whether they're being correct or not, has really not mattered very much. Now, in political campaigns, there's always been a question of exaggeration. There's always been a question of rumors, of misrepresentation. I think about things like the Swift boat efforts to discredit John Kerry when he was running for president against Bush 43. But this year, the candidates themselves have really come to understand what I think is the basic cynicism and frustration of the electorate, and that if you are loyal to either one of the candidates, you probably understand that what they're saying may not be true, may not make sense, but nonetheless, you have a general feeling that you're for one or the other, and that if indeed the media criticizes what is said, that just proves our bias against that candidate. And so when I managed to cover both conventions this year, and between Cleveland and Philadelphia, I went to San Diego for something called Comic-Con, which is a convention where people dress up in their favorite character's costume. And that seemed a whole lot closer to reality than what I saw in Cleveland or Philadelphia. And so, Trump has been rather consistent in his ability to exaggerate. This is not new for him. I've known Trump for more than 30 years. He told me in the 80s that he had sold 12 million hardcover copies of The Art of the Deal, and when I checked recently, at least according to Amazon, it's closer to 1 million. But, the difference between a 1 and 12 it's only 11, so it's not all that great. But when the Washington Post has, for years, had something called their Pinocchio Awards, and the biggest Pinocchio award is 4 stars, and Trump has gotten more Pinocchio awards this year than the last 4 candidates for president combined in either party. And, it is just part of his belief, part of his demeanor. He comes to this from not only his years in the real estate business and negotiating, where you never let the other side know what you're thinking, but also from his years as a celebrity on television with The Apprentice and Celebrity Apprentice, where, in fact, the business advice has actually been pretty terrible, but nonetheless, it's been very watchable television. And I think he comes to this event seeing it as a media opportunity that grows out of his own experience. He has a general belief that facts are not important, they get in the way, and he has a base that clearly embraces that belief, that is so frustrated with the ways in which our government in Washington has not worked, that the fact that he says things that are completely opposite from what may be the case actually is perceived as a virtue. He feels that in negotiation, if the other side doesn't really know what your intent is and what you believe, that's a plus, where I think anybody who has tried to cover, especially international relations over the years, realizes the dangers from misunderstanding or from false signals. All you have to think about is Dean Acheson's speech in 1949 suggesting that Korea was not of strategic importance to the United States, to understand the consequences of the other side not fully appreciating or understanding the difference between what you're saying and what you believe. And yet, I think for Trump, that kind of misdirection he sees as a virtue. If I say we're going to build a wall with Mexico because of all these terrible rapists and criminals who are coming here, and then go to Mexico City and tell the president what wonderful people Mexicans are, he doesn't see any real disconnect there. And if you add to that just an unwillingness to be candid, that does create some real issues for the press in terms of coverage, but also for the electorate. The failure to disclose tax returns, I think, is very much a function of his understanding that what the tax returns are likely to show is that he's not as rich or as successful as he would have you believe, and his whole legitimacy of his race for president is based on his success as a business executive. Now, what I think he'd actually say is part of my success as a business executive is I figured out how to avoid paying taxes for most of my life. And again, there's a base that would accept that and say, yeah, that's an example of why we should have him as president. His own health, this year, our two candidates, these are the two oldest candidates that we've had running for an election. They'd be probably right at home in Japan in terms of some of the prime ministers over the last few decades. But within the U.S., only Reagan running for a second term was an older candidate than Trump and Clinton. But his medical records consist of a doctor who talked to him for 5 minutes saying he's in great health, the best health, the hugest health, and so forth. And in many ways, Hillary Clinton is sort of a mirror image of that. She, I think, actually would be there's a lot to suggest that she could be a very good president, but she has not been a very good candidate. And part of that is that I think her nature is to be secretive, her nature is to be defensive, and also to recognize that she feels, in a way, this is a nomination she deserves and that she doesn't have to answer every question along the way. This last week, she did meet with the press 3 or 4 times, but before that, she'd gone more than 9 months without having a press conference. And I think a part of that was just a general defensiveness. Some of it's clearly related to the use of her own server and the emails. I'm in the Bernie Sanders camp that says it's enough already with the emails, but it is a gift that keeps on giving for reporters and for her opponents. And I think when conflated with the genuine issues about the ways in which the Clinton Foundation, which has done a lot of good in a lot of places in the world, has nonetheless been a source of income for the family, it does raise questions that she's not wanted to talk much about. And so we have some very important issues that really, I think, are of concern to an electorate domestically. Certainly the question of income inequality is an important one. Certainly the question of economic growth after the very serious recession of 2008, 2009. The economy, even though growing, has been growing very slowly without the kind of job creation that, say, took place during the Bill Clinton's 8 years in office. But getting the opportunity to talk about those kinds of issues is increasingly difficult when the candidates themselves really want to focus so much on the inadequacies of their opposition. My favorite bumper sticker, we have political bumper stickers on cars, and my favorite is the one that says, "My candidate's an idiot, your candidate is worse." And that I think suggests what is some of the problems. When I think about Trump and about how you try to run against him, I'm reminded of the George Bernard Shaw quote that said, "Never mud wrestle with a pig. You'll both get dirty and the pig will enjoy it." And I think that, in fact, Trump is all about denigrating his opponents. We saw it through the whole primary season, where with great effectiveness he could reduce Jeb Bush to someone who lacked energy, Marco Rubio to being little Marco, Ted Cruz to being lying Ted, and so forth. And that kind of schoolyard bully's ability to come up with the turn of phrase has been very effective. It has tended to make Hillary Clinton's issues with email or with the Clinton Foundation equated to sort of the worst sins that you can think of a candidate possibly committing. And yet when I compare it to Trump's own his corporate bankruptcies in 4 different occasions and the impact that had on people, it's hard for me to say that that's a virtue that shows great business acumen, but it is one of those things that we try to cover. I think the other thing that is very interesting in this campaign is the role that digital media has had, the role that social has had in terms of the story, and the ways in which candidates are really able to connect to their electorate without having to pay a whole lot of attention to what the traditional media has had to say about them. Trump, who is not particularly a digital native, has nonetheless made very effective use of Twitter and of that quick one-liner that he can get out very fast. The Clinton campaign is very much built around an operation primarily in Brooklyn of very good data scientists who have figured out not only ways to find an electorate, but ways to speak directly to it. And so I think that just reflects all the changes in media that any of us who are in the business have certainly felt over the last decade. And just as we at Time Inc. are reinventing ourselves, having been spun off from our parent Time Warner after a 25-year association, what we find is that it's not enough just to print magazines, but that we also have to have a presence on mobile. We have to have a presence with video. We have to have a presence with events. And those are all the kinds of things that we hope to be doing internationally. But it is just a reflection of how quickly media has changed. And if you can get a terrific cartoon or ad that goes viral, you can get a far bigger audience for it on mobile than any of us in traditional media may hope for. And I think the candidates are doing some very inventive work that way, just reflecting those kinds of changes. It's always dangerous to make a prediction, and with this latest health episode of Hillary Clinton's, you probably have to say that the odds are still that she'll be the candidate in November and she'll be running, but it's not quite the certainty that I thought it was 3 days ago if you would have asked me. If you look at the election, I think it will, in terms of the popular vote, it could be quite a close one. But that if you actually look at the way we elect a president and the role that the states play with the Electoral College, and you throw into it two non-traditional candidates representing the Libertarian and Green parties, it seems to me difficult to paint a picture where Trump is able to get enough electoral votes to be successful. But that assumes, again, that there are not exogenous events that could change that, whether it's the health of either candidate, whether it's some kind of global terrorist problem or something like that that could very easily swing an electorate in the last few days. So I think this is going to continue to be a great news event that's going to be not only important to people living in the U.S., but globally as well. And, whether it's sitting in North Asia thinking about what he says about nuclear arms in Japan or Korea, or about how he's going to negotiate with China, these are going to be issues that are going to be capturing our attention, not only through the election, but certainly in a period after that, because I think it has raised so many new issues for people who are thinking about having to choose the next president of the United States. So with that, what I know about these lunches is they're a whole lot more interesting when you have a chance to ask some questions or to make some comments, and I'd be happy to, at this point, open it up to questions and then try to be as responsive as I can. And again, thanks for the chance to visit with you today. It's always great to be back at the FCCJ. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Pearlstine. We'll open the floor to questions. This is a bit more diverse audience than we usually have, but as is our tradition, we'll start with the working press. Are there any members of the working press here who have any questions, who want to? Please go over to, and please give your name and your affiliation.
Hi, I'm Hal Foster. I'm a freelancer now. I used to work for the Los Angeles Times. I was one of Marty Barron's proteges there when he was still at the Times. And Mike Tharp says hello.
Right.
Okay. Tell me what a content editor is these days. Yes. I really would like to know what that is.
Well, I'm a little bit responsible for creating this beast. When I went to Bloomberg, Dan Doctoroff, who was the CEO, said, well, we have an editor-in-chief, and I don't want you doing what Matt Winkler's doing, so we need to come up with a new name. And we thought about it, and we came up with something called Chief Content Officer, having no idea what it meant, but thinking it gave me enough license to do a lot of different stuff. Since then, it's become a fairly common change. And when I came to Time Inc. 3 years ago, Joe Rip, the CEO, I said I would be happy to go back to being an editor-in-chief. I liked that title and thought it was pretty good. I said, no, that talks too much of separation of edit from the rest of the company, and as a spin-off from Time Warner that's trying to migrate from being a print division to being a multi-platform, multimedia company. I want you really thinking not only about traditional edit issues, that stories that you put in magazines, but I really want to think a lot about the ways in which edit can cooperate in creating new ventures, new products, and new markets. And certainly one of the areas that gets included in all this is something which is either called branded content or native advertising. And what this largely looks like from a distance is that all the advertisers who've been complaining about news for years want to create ads that look like the news they've been complaining about. And so that creates real challenges for editors. And one of the things that I've tried to do, both at Time Inc. and in my role as a board member at the American Society of Magazine Editors, is to think about rules of the road for some of these emerging new products that really grow out of some technological change. And you know, there are a number of organizations that we compete with for revenue, for instance, where consciously there's no distinction between creating content for readers and viewers and creating content for advertisers. A number of these new digital-only platforms really don't make that distinction. And so that's where a chief content officer comes in, is that I'm not only thinking about what works in our traditional media products, but in some of these newer areas. We've left the Time Life building where we were for 55 years, a building that appropriately was where Mad Men was filmed, because it was such a perfect example of an office of the 1960s. But in moving, we not only went to an open floor plan and a facility down in Battery Park City in the old World Financial Center, but we've created a new center in Brooklyn, a Skunk Works we call the Foundry, where we're creating new products, particularly, you know, competing with ad agencies, competing with public relations firms in creating products for providers of goods and services, some under white label, some that are just very different from anything that we've produced. And so that's why the title has replaced that of editor-in-chief, is that the responsibilities go beyond that.
Any other questions from the working press? If not, I'll open the floor to anyone who has a question. Just raise your hand. And
Norman, good to hear from you. Good to see you.
I'm also Norman. I'm Norman Tolman. I think maybe I'm the oldest member of this press club by now. And I knew our speaker, I've known him for 47 years, when he used to buy those big things on the wall over there from me.
They weren't that big because I couldn't afford them then, Norman.
And she couldn't even make them that big.
And now I couldn't even get close.
My question is about content, but content as a reader. I'm a good friend of Ed Reingold and Herman Nickel. And when the magazine came out, the only thing they were interested in was, what would Mr. Luce say? And when I hear what you've been saying now is what the advertisers will say, and of course, I know how important that is. But what would Mr. Luce say about the content of the magazine now? Because I tried to read it, but there's nothing to read. But the ads are great. I mean, I want to help one part.
Well, we wish we had more of both. But
well, if to write better, maybe you can get people to advertise better. But I find the magazine now quite disappointing because there's nothing to read. And what would Mr. Luce say?
Sure. Well, first of all, Luce died in 1967, and I didn't get to Time Inc. until 1994. So, but I've spent a lot of time reading him, and I have a point of view on this. But first of all, I would actually take great issue with your characterization of the content of Time or of Fortune or of any of the other 84 magazines that are part of Time Inc. I think the remarkable thing to me is that week after week there's extraordinary things to read, and indeed there's still an audience for print that expects the same level of editorial consistency and editorial quality that that has been a part of Time Inc. from the time Luce founded Time in 1923. What has changed is very much reader appetites. In an age where 144 characters sometimes passes for long form, the readers desire for very long pieces is challenged every week. In a time when events are covered by so many different outlets in so many different ways, the role of a weekly is put up to question every week and is challenged. If you watched the Olympics out of Rio for 2 weeks, you will understand why Sports Illustrated, the week after the Olympics ended, went with a fall football preview, because by the time you would get a print product in your hands 3 or 4 days after the Olympics had ended, there was really not a whole lot of appetite for a rehash. So in that respect, I think consumer demand has changed. With regard to Luce himself, I think one has to realize, first of all, he began on the business side. He was not the editor initially. The editor was Britt Haddon, who died in 1930, and it was only then that Luce asserted an editorial position. And for many of those years, ideology was an important part of the Time formula. There were, you think about everything from his opposition to the PRC being admitted to the United Nations, because of his support of Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang as an example, where he saw part of the role of Time in that period of, as he defined it, the American century, of being a kind of muscular supporter of a clear editorial point of view. And it was only when Henry Grunwald came in as editor after Otto Feubringer that you saw Time willing to question things like the war in Vietnam. And, that's something that I think Luce might not have accepted, but was kind of an important development in the history of the company. What people forget about Luce was that he was at core a business executive who, wanted to make sure that the profits were sufficient to fund the journalism that he so cared about. And so, prior to the merger with Warner in 1990, people forget that Time magazine had a cable division called ATC that had started really in the last days of Luce. That HBO was created at Time Inc. and was about a paid video service. That there was a documentary division called The March of Time that actually won an Oscar and was deeply committed to video, and that it had some pretty major failures along the way. TV Cable Week was one example. So I think trying to figure out what Luce would be saying if he saw things today, my sense is that he was an innovator, he was an entrepreneur, he cared about quality journalism, and would want us to be as committed to it as I believe we are. But he would also be open to new formats, new opportunities, and new ways of telling stories.
If I could jump in just quickly, sort of follow up to that question, what is the future of the general news magazine? I think Time was obviously at one point kind of an agenda setter in the U.S. and a very dominant form of media. A while back, we all thought there was no future for these magazines; they were going to disappear, and yet now they're coming back in different forms and reinventing themselves.
Well, it's a very good and very tough question. We obviously spent a lot of time thinking about. We still deliver 30 million print copies a month of our U.S. magazines to subscribers. Now, that's 23 different magazines. That's not just Time. Time itself has a domestic circulation of 3 million, and about 700,000 copies are sold every week outside the United States. There is no doubt competition for content. The law of supply and demand works, and there's just a ton of supply. But having said that, when Time gets a story right, it has profound influence. And if you just listen to Donald Trump and his reactions to the various covers, beginning with his very public dissent from our choice of Angela Merkel as Person of the Year instead of Donald Trump in 2015, followed by his posing with the bald eagle, looking at it somewhat suspiciously, to his reaction to the meltdown cover of 3 weeks ago. You realize that he at least thinks of it as having extraordinary influence, even as a weekly. I think there is still a print audience for synthesis, for analysis, for making sense of information, and that's true whether it's Time, whether it's Fortune, whether it's People, which is by far our most successful publication, or for some of our narrower publications like Southern Living or Sunset or Coastal Living. At the same time, I think we all recognize that if all we do is print, that's going to be a difficult future, in large part because advertisers, I think, have increasingly come to look at trying to figure out a way to get their messages across in mobile, in video, and through participatory events. It's not yet clear that those outlets work for advertising, but it has certainly put pressure on print, and I think any company that decides it's going to be print only has to hope that all of us in this room live a whole lot longer, because I think the generation of kids coming in now, really as digital natives, may in fact enjoy print and picking up something, but it's not going to be essential reading for them.
More questions?
I'm Komatsu. I'm a lifelong supporter of Democrats, but I ask you about Republican Party. Are there any moderate intellectual candidates in Republican Party, such as Rockefeller, Eisenhower, or Nixon? We all had this year were ultra-conservative or Tea Party kind of people. So are there any reliable moderates in the Republican Party in the U.S.?
Well, it's a very good question, and certainly the definition of moderate has changed. What I think we're really witnessing is a kind of pressures on both traditional parties from within, and that ideally there would be a kind of realignment of the parties, but I don't know that that's necessarily going to happen just because change is so difficult to affect. But of the 15 or 16 candidates that wanted to be president on the Republican side, I think Jeb Bush was a moderate by standards of the party, more on economic issues, more than necessarily on social. I'd say probably the same for Kasich, but that neither got much traction within the party, and I think that's partly just a frustration with politics in Washington and the perpetual gridlock that has been a part of the party. I think within the Democrats, certainly the phenomenon of Bernie Sanders was very much playing to a part of the party that also felt excluded from the process, and felt that whether it was on questions of income equality and so forth, that they may not have really understood the issues. There's almost a kind of anti-intellectualism that says that experts just always get it wrong, so why should we pay any attention to them? At the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia, there were a lot of people carrying signs that said no TPP. And I would walk up to them and I'd just say, "What's TPP?" And they'd look at me like, "Well, it's about trade and I'm against it." And I'd say, "Well, what does TPP mean, and what is it that you don't like?" And it was whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, it is very easy to find communities that have been adversely affected by globalization. It's true that when, in the years following China's entering the WTO, there was some job migration out of the U.S. that might have been precipitated by it. My own view is that the trade-off was more than worth it for the society, and that some of that job erosion would have continued anyway. But my guess is that you will find some moderates within the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, but that in fact there might have to be a kind of realignment where a Tea Party populist group of Republicans and Democrats will find common cause against a more traditional, more moderate, less progressive kind of party. I was just thinking of it. It's been, 24 years since Bill and Hillary and Alan Tipper were dancing to Fleetwood Mac in New York City at the end of the Democratic convention that led to Bill Clinton's nomination. And today, they were considered the progressives who were attacking the moderates at that point, and today they're looked at as very much the old guard. So a lot of that has changed rather quickly. I don't see this current Republican Party easily inviting a moderate to a senior position. If that were the case, Michael Bloomberg would have been able to run as a Republican candidate for president, but all his surveys suggested that he could not get the nomination. Yes.
Hi, thank you for coming to the club again. I'm Kazuo Biko, formerly with AP, now freelance. And you mentioned about the state of magazine journalism, but I would like to hear from you about the state of American newspapers, because the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, those that have a strong brand, is doing fairly well, but the other regional newspapers are really struggling. Like Tribune Publishing Company is now called a trunk. Yes. That's ridiculed by John Oliver.
Right.
And what do you think the future of American newspapers?
Right. Well, there's a couple things going on. In some ways, before I get to newspapers, I would just say that there are a couple things that I think one has to recognize that are changing in journalism, and it's a mixed bag. In some ways, it's never been a better time to be a reporter. The power of search to help you research, the power of social to create a voice for yourself is very different from before. I think of some of these so self-identified beauty experts who have blogs that have audiences as big as some traditional brands' websites. When I think of various not-for-profit initiatives to fund journalism, whether it is the Marshall Project that Bill Keller, the former editor of the New York Times, is now running about criminal justice, or ProPublica, which Paul Steiger, the former editor of the Wall Street Journal, is doing for investigative reporting, or Inside Climate News, a nonpartisan not-for-profit that is solely covering climate change with some very good journalists who used to be at large organizations. And you see examples like that are actually quite interesting. Gordon Krovitz, the former publisher of the Wall Street Journal, is funding an initiative in Denver where 10 reporters are just doing local coverage of Colorado in an effort to create an alternative to the local paper. And you see some examples like that suggest that there are opportunities for local coverage that may be different from anything that we've seen in the past in terms of how they're funded and how they're supported. Having said that, when you think about what a newspaper has traditionally done, that it has been a publication of record providing timely information, and that through its classified advertising it was creating a marketplace for buyers and sellers, And then you think about what the internet has accomplished. It's much easier to be a publication of record when you don't have a news hole. It's much easier to be timely when you don't have to put words on paper and then put them on a truck to deliver them. And as Craigslist certainly has shown, classified advertising works very well outside of a newspaper format. So the traditional sources of revenue for newspapers, I think, is even more challenged than for magazines, because magazines have passionate audiences that are built around not just physical location, but really a psychographic as well. And I think newspapers are, aside from these national ones you suggest, like the Journal and the Times, basically are in local environments where it's very hard to charge for content. And so that, I think, makes it fairly difficult. We've seen some interesting efforts to address that. I don't know that many of them have worked. The Newhouse chain is now in New Orleans only publishing 3 days a week. In Cleveland, it, I think, only on weekends has home delivery. Hearst in Seattle has actually stopped its print product and just is doing digital, but so far none of those efforts by traditional media have gotten much traction. So my guess is that there will be some new formats developed that will deliver content at a local level. I worry a lot about coverage of state houses, because in America the states actually can do a lot of things that affect citizens, and it's been an historic place for corruption and so forth, where aggressive coverage has really been important, and that's been one of the things that I think has really been sacrificed with all the budget cuts and all the efforts to trim. So that would suggest that future for state and local coverage is going to be tricky for a while, but I think some new opportunities will emerge. Yes.
Sure.
I hate talking about Trump and Hillary these days. That's why I didn't ask you a question to start with, but I'm going to ask one, and that is that it seems to me that some newspapers in the United States are so fearful that Donald Trump will ruin the country that they've crossed the line between what we used to call objective journalism. I'm thinking in terms of, for example, of that huge editorial that the Washington Post did, but I see other signs of it as well. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, well, some of it is precisely what you suggest, which is that, Trump really has spooked a lot of people, and, it's not just an occasional hysterical columnist who has drawn analogies to 1933. I mean, you hear Meg Whitman, who was a candidate for governor in California as a Republican, talking in terms like that as CEO of Hewlett Packard. So some of it is some genuine concerns about Trump and a question of whether, if you don't take a stand now, when do you? For others, I think it is also an evolution that is not just about politics, where as newspapers try to remain relevant for their audiences, they move much more into space that has been traditionally that of magazines. In 1953, Henry Luce put Joe McCarthy on the cover of Time with one word under the image of McCarthy. It just had the word demagogue. And that was a big surprise to a lot of people, including McCarthy, because he wrote Luce and said, I thought you would be with me since we're both such rabid anti-communists. And Luce wrote back and said, well, yes, we're both anti-communists, but the communists do enough bad things that are true that you don't have to make up stuff. And that's why I'm calling you a demagogue. But, nobody expected a magazine to adhere to those standards of objectivity of all the news that's fit to print that has been so identified with quality newspapers. And I think that not just in politics, but in general coverage, there's much more opinion creeping into the news pages of many of our best publications. And so some of what you're seeing may reflect that as much as a general concern about Trump. It's interesting that the Clinton people complain that the American press hasn't been critical enough of Trump. And not just print, but you think about all the criticism of Matt Lauer at the security speeches, that he was much tougher on Clinton than he was on Trump, and we hear from them about as much as we hear from Trump. So this is not one where I think two wrongs make a right or anything like that, but I think it's a much more nuanced and complicated issue than just that a bunch of newspaper editors have freaked out over Donald Trump running and decided they're going to attack him. And if anything, those attacks tend to be greeted by his base as proof of bias, and so they may even be counterproductive.
More questions from the floor? Why don't you go first, then after?
Hi, Russell Saito, associate member. With the move from print to internet, the globalization, you can access local markets more effectively. And you talked about some of the U.S. strategies to access, markets, maybe local markets within the U.S. But in terms of your international strategy, perhaps even specific to Japan, it's a little bit easier to adapt the stories that I'm sure that you're working to make stories that appeal to global consumers. But with the advent of quick translations, real-time social media, you can actually adapt it even more to that local market. So what are some of your strategies for the international move, and perhaps even specific to Japan?
Right.
Thank you.
Well, I'm glad Mr. Marcapoto and his colleagues are with me here, because that's what they're supposed to sort of figure out and come up with. But I'll give you just a few examples. As someone who's spent a lot of his career in pan-regional English language publishing, I've come to realize that has been and remains a tough business, but there are discrete audiences for it. One of the things that's always been difficult in the past has been trying to penetrate local markets for a couple of reasons. Some is a question of language. Some of it is a question of really, whether any foreign media understands a local, any country well enough to really say something profound and different and get a large enough audience to get commercial support for it. And some of it has been technology. Newsweek was well ahead of time, for example, in creating a Japanese language edition, a Korean language edition. We never saw ways to make those economics work. But as you rightly suggest, we're getting a whole lot closer to being able to do quick, simultaneous translation benefiting from machine learning. The Wall Street Journal, I think, has shown in its digital space that it can do local language. The FT was very early with a Chinese language service. And I think there'll be other examples of that where we will, in a digital space, think about ways in which, a couple of things happen. One is that it's easier than ever for people who care about what's going on in another country to get information, whether it's, and so there's about 30%, I think, of Time.com's audience is actually outside the U.S., and it's largely people that are looking particularly for content from the U.S. But as we look out to the future, I think local language for local markets is certainly one of the things that we'll want to be looking at. What I think we have to be careful about is that kind of arrogance that just presumes that all you have to do is, translate your content and there'll be a big audience for it, because not everything that works in one market works in all markets. In fact, most things don't. And so I think you want to be very careful to make sure before you move into that space that that you actually can provide content of value, and that you're not embarrassing yourself along the way. I think the other thing that is really interesting to explore is the ways in which globalization, notwithstanding its criticism, creates global markets, so that if you wanted to do something on real estate, you might be able to create a global product so that people who are wanting to invest outside their own borders might gravitate toward it. Or if you wanted to do something on education or on healthcare or on longevity, these are kinds of subjects that you might find a very receptive global audience for, and that might actually be an easier way to try to penetrate a market than to try to create local coverage in local language. Yes, sir.
My name is Hiroki Fujita, freelance, currently contributing to a Yukon Fuji Daily evening paper. Even daily paper is too slow because it reports the day before, because it's a time of real time. So the weekly magazine can beat the daily paper real time report with in-depth analysis. And I'd like to know, in that regard, your view on what's going on in East Asia now. Like China is expanding militarily to South China Sea, where the North Korea is launching missiles on a daily basis, and then they say they can install the nuclear heads. So what kind of power balance can you see in this particular region? And Japan has a alliance with military alliance with the U.S.
Well, that's a very good question, and a real challenge for any of us in the business. I think that a large part of what we have to do is provide analysis, to provide interpretation, to try to make sense of information. I think one of the other things that we have to be very careful to recognize is that, as you suggest, if you're just being a backwards-looking summary of what's happened, you're not going to find much of an audience. And so, I think you have to be smart enough to think about what's the topic that's going to be out over the horizon that people are going to be talking about a few weeks from now, rather than looking back. That's when we're at our best, when we're not so far ahead that nobody wants to think about it or talk about it. That's not good either. But that you can sort of capture the conversation, but by really saying something forward-looking. And that's a challenge every week. There's certain events that are just of such significance that you have to write about them. You can't imagine being a weekly that didn't cover North Korea's nuclear test this week if you're going to find a readership in North Asia. On the other hand, I think you have to say something beyond saying that this creates challenges for countries who are trying to figure out whether to have more sanctions or to go back to discussions or to ignore. I think you have to have a point of view about what one should do about that, and you have to have some reporting. That, for instance, to me, I would ask the question this week: is it in China's interest to continue to have North Korea behaving like it's a rogue state that they can't control, or is it at some point in China's interest to try to exert more influence over the behavior of a state that would probably collapse pretty quickly without Chinese support? That's a hard one to answer because none of us are clairvoyant about what's going on in China, let alone in Pyongyang. But that's the kind of thing where I think a periodical can add some intelligence that goes beyond the mere event itself. And I'm just sort of a quick knee-jerk reaction.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, so I'd like to thank Mr. Pearlstine for sharing some of his valuable time with us today. And as is our tradition, we'd like to present you, Mr. Pearlstine, with a one-year honourary membership in the
Wonderful.
Foreign Correspondence
I will
Japan.
do my best
So
to get here
hope
and
you
make
come
use
back-
of it.
come back
Thank you.
again.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you.